The young couple had been driving through a backroad forest late at night, trying to take a shortcut to save time. Lily and Chris were headed to a wedding in a neighboring town, and they'd taken this detour after spotting it on their GPS. The map promised it would shave off nearly an hour, but as they went deeper into the forest, they began to feel a creeping sense of unease. Tall trees crowded both sides of the narrow road, their twisted branches forming eerie shapes against the darkening sky. The road grew bumpier with each passing mile, and the only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath their tires and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind cut through the woods. When they came around a tight bend, the headlights illuminated something lying across the road. Chris slowed the car to a stop. In the beams of their headlights, they saw a woman lying motionless, one arm stretched towards the car. She wore a tattered dress, and her face was obscured by her hair. Dirt smudged her arms, and her clothes looked like they'd been torn and stained with mud. Lily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and concern. Chris hesitated, gripping the wheel, debating whether they should get out or call for help. But before he could reach for his phone, the woman stirred, slowly lifting her head, revealing eyes that were wild and wide with fear. Her lips moved as if she were trying to speak, but no sound came out. With a shaky hand, she motioned for them to come closer. Against his instincts, Chris opened his door. Lily grabbed his arm, hissing for him to stay in the car, but he shrugged her off. He told her to lock the doors and wait. Reluctantly, Lily did as he asked, but she kept her eyes on him, ready to yell if anything went wrong. As Chris approached the woman, he noticed something strange. She had a thick rope tied around her ankle, frayed at the end as if it had been hastily cut. She met his gaze with desperate eyes, and in a barely audible whisper, she said, "Please, he's coming." Chris's stomach dropped. He turned, glancing at the tree line, but saw nothing but shadows. "What happened?" he asked, voice low. But before she could respond, a powerful beam of light burst through the darkness, casting blinding rays through the trees. A vehicle roared to life somewhere down the road behind them. Chris felt an icy chill run down his spine as the rumble grew louder, like a beast barreling towards them. The woman's eyes widened in terror, and without a second thought, she scrambled to her feet and stumbled toward the woods. "Get in the car!" Chris shouted, but she was gone, melting into the shadows. He sprinted back to his car, wrenching open the door and diving inside as the sound of the vehicle drew closer, the headlights getting brighter, sharper. Lily was breathing heavily, clutching her phone in her hand. "What's happening? Who's coming?" "I don't know. Just lock the doors." Chris slammed his own door shut, locking it as he threw the car in reverse. Just as he began to back up, an old, rusted truck screeched around the bend. It barreled down the road toward them, its headlights so intense they seemed almost unnatural, blinding Chris through the rearview mirror. Chris reversed as quickly as he could, the wheels spinning and kicking up gravel, but the truck kept gaining on them. The truck's horn blared, a deep, relentless honking that shattered the stillness of the forest and rattled their bones. The man behind the wheel looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were sunken, and his mouth twisted in a malicious grin that looked inhuman under the glare of the headlights. Suddenly, he swerved, ramming the side of their car. Lily screamed as they were jolted sideways, her hand reaching for Chris's arm. He fought to keep control of the car as they veered onto the edge of the road, inches from the ditch. Chris stomped on the accelerator, his heart hammering as he tried to outmaneuver the truck, but no matter how fast he went, the truck stayed on them, matching their every swerve and turn. They were nearing a clearing when Chris saw a narrow dirt road leading off to the right. Without a second thought, he veered onto it, hoping to lose their pursuer in the darkness. The road was barely wide enough for their car, lined with thick trees and dense foliage that seemed to swallow them whole. They drove for what felt like miles, the sounds of the truck's engine fading behind them. Only then did they stop, breathing heavily, gripping each other's hands in the dark silence. "Is he gone?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. Chris listened, straining his ears. All he could hear was the steady thump of his heartbeat and the creak of cooling metal. But just as he was beginning to relax, he noticed something, a faint, rhythmic tap coming from somewhere outside the car. Tap! Tap! It was slow, deliberate, like someone gently rapping on the glass. Chris turned, looking toward the back window, but it was too dark to see anything. With his phone flashlight, he pointed it toward the source of the noise. His heart sank. Outside the window, pressed against the glass, was a bloody handprint smeared along the side of their car. Lily gasped, covering her mouth, eyes wide with horror. Before either of them could move, the tapping grew louder, more insistent, spreading across all the windows. It felt as though a dozen unseen hands were pressing in on them, trying to break through the glass. In a panic, Chris started the car, slamming his foot on the gas. They sped down the narrow path, branches scraping against the sides like skeletal fingers trying to claw their way inside. He didn't know where the road led, but he didn't care. They just had to get away. They drove for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper into the wilderness, until the road ended abruptly in a clearing. The car lurched to a halt, the engine sputtering as they realized they had nowhere else to go. They sat in silence, breathing heavily, staring into the darkness around them, waiting for something, anything, to move. Suddenly, from behind them, headlights appeared, piercing through the trees like two glaring eyes. The truck had found them. It rolled slowly into the clearing, its lights casting long shadows as it approached. Chris knew there was no escape. They were trapped. As the truck stopped a few yards away, the driver's door creaked open, and a figure stepped out, slowly, deliberately. The man's grin was visible even from a distance, his eyes glinting with something dark and twisted. He took a step forward, and then another, his boots crunching against the gravel. Chris and Lily clung to each other, too terrified to move, their hearts pounding as the man's steps grew louder, closer. And then, with a sickening realization, Chris remembered the woman on the road, the one with the rope around her ankle. She had been trying to escape. Alyssa hated driving through the mountains at night, but she had no choice. Her grandmother had fallen ill suddenly, and the only way to reach her was to cut through a winding mountain road that had a reputation for being eerie, even in daylight. Locals whispered about disappearances and strange sightings along that route, stories she had always dismissed as small-town legends. But tonight, alone in her car with nothing but her headlights slicing through the thick fog, she began to feel like those stories might hold a sliver of truth. The road twisted and turned sharply, forcing her to drive slowly, hands tight on the wheel. She tried to keep her mind off the feeling of isolation, of being miles away from help or cell signal. The radio had long since turned to static, leaving her in silence. Just her and the hum of the engine. As she rounded a bend, her headlights illuminated something in the distance. A figure standing by the side of the road, waving a limp hand. Alyssa's heart pounded. It was rare to see anyone out here, especially at this hour. She debated slowing down, but felt a chill as she noticed the figure's clothes, a long, tattered dress that looked soaked and muddy. The figure had a slumped posture, and her face was obscured by a curtain of matted hair. Alyssa's foot hovered over the brake, but something told her to keep going. She averted her eyes as she passed, hoping the figure wouldn't see her hesitation. But just as she accelerated, she caught a glimpse in her rearview mirror. The figure was no longer on the roadside. It was in the middle of the road, directly behind her car, staring after her with a lifeless, hollow expression. She felt a shiver slide down her spine as she sped up, pushing her car faster than she knew she should on the slick mountain road. The image of the figure lingered in her mind. She tried to shake it off, convincing herself it was a trick of the fog, a figment of her imagination. Just as she began to feel her nerves calming, she saw something in her rearview mirror again. Her blood ran cold. The figure was there, much closer this time, now in the backseat of her car, hunched and staring at her with dark, unblinking eyes. Alyssa nearly screamed, swerving the car, but when she glanced back to look again, the seat was empty. She slammed the brakes, pulling to the side of the road, her chest heaving as she looked around, expecting the figure to appear in the shadows beyond the headlights. She waited, gripping the wheel, straining to see anything in the thick fog and darkness, but nothing moved. Alyssa finally convinced herself that her mind was playing tricks on her. Too many ghost stories and too little sleep. Taking a deep breath, she pulled back onto the road and continued driving, though her heart raced with every shadow that danced in her headlights. Another few miles passed without incident, and she began to feel some relief. But as she approached a sharp turn, Her headlights fell on something that made her heart stop. There, on the roadside, was the same figure, motionless, staring at her. This time, Alyssa knew it was no illusion. The woman's face was visible now, gaunt and pale, eyes sunken and lifeless. And she was smiling, a twisted, joyless grin that made Alyssa's skin crawl. The woman's hand slowly lifted, pointing a bony finger down the road as if beckoning her to follow. Alyssa's hands shook, but she didn't dare stop. She gripped the wheel and sped past the figure, trying to keep her eyes straight ahead, desperate to get away. But even as she drove faster and faster, she couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was somehow closer, as if she were being pulled along, following her at an impossible speed. She was almost at the end of the mountain pass when the car began to sputter. Her heart sank as she realized she was running out of gas. Alyssa cursed herself for not filling up in the last town, but it was too late now. The car gave one final shudder and stopped. She sat in silence, the only sound her own shallow breathing. The fog was thicker here, curling around the car like fingers. She tried her phone, but there was no signal. Alyssa glanced in the rearview mirror, her pulse racing, half expecting to see the woman's face staring back at her from the back seat. For a few moments, there was only silence until she heard something tapping on the window. Alyssa froze, her heart thundering in her chest. The tapping was slow, deliberate, like someone was testing the glass. She turned her head slowly, barely able to breathe, and saw a pale, skeletal hand tapping on the driver's side window. The hand was covered in dirt, fingers too long, fingernails broken and caked with grime. The figure's face appeared in the window, pressing against the glass. That same grin stretched wide across her face, teeth dark and cracked. Her eyes were empty, like black pits. Alyssa's throat closed in a silent scream as she struggled to reach for her door lock, but her body felt frozen. The woman leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass as she whispered something Alyssa couldn't hear. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, the woman backed away from the car and stood in the fog, watching Alyssa with that sickening smile. Alyssa could feel the weight of her gaze, like something cold pressing down on her. A sudden beam of headlights broke through the fog from the other direction, startling Alyssa back to her senses. She turned, seeing a truck approaching. Desperation surged in her, and she began frantically waving her hands, hoping the driver would see her. The truck slowed, pulling up beside her. The driver, an older man with a concerned expression, rolled down his window. "Are you all right?" he asked, eyeing her pale face. Alyssa nodded shakily, barely able to speak. Did you see her?" she stammered. The man's face darkened. "Who, dear?" "The woman. She was here, right there." Alyssa turned to point, but the fog was empty. There was no sign of the woman, just the dense mist curling around the trees. The man looked at her carefully. "You're lucky, you know. Not everyone makes it through this road. Few people know it, but the locals call this the Dead Mile. That woman, folks around here say she's been out here for years, hitching a ride, looking for someone to join her." Alyssa felt a chill as she looked back toward the road. The fog seemed to part for a moment, and she thought she saw the outline of a figure standing just beyond the reach of the headlights, watching her, waiting for her. And then she was gone. It was a crisp October evening, and Marcus was out camping alone in the woods, miles from the nearest town. He had come out here for solitude, a break from the constant buzz of city life, and he'd been looking forward to a quiet night by the fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the trees cast long shadows and a dense fog began to settle, blurring the world around him. He had chosen a spot next to a lake, pitching his tent beneath a towering pine, and now he sat by the fire, warming his hands as he listened to the water lapping against the shore. But as the darkness settled, an eerie silence fell over the forest. The usual sounds of chirping insects and rustling leaves were gone, replaced by a strange, oppressive stillness. Marcus glanced around, suddenly feeling as if he were being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He shook off the feeling, dismissing it as a byproduct of being alone in the woods. But just as he started to relax, he heard a faint sound, a whisper. It was soft, he almost thought he'd imagined it, but then it came again, drifting through the fog. "Marcus?" He froze, heart pounding. He hadn't told anyone he was coming here. No one even knew his exact location. There was no way someone should know his name, let alone be out here whispering it. "Marcus!" The voice was low, drawn out, almost like a sigh, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of the lake. He strained to see through the mist, but there was only darkness and the faint glimmer of moonlight on the water. His pulse quickened as he scanned the shore, but he saw nothing. Trying to ignore the creeping fear settling into his bones, he convinced himself it was just the wind. He turned back to the fire, pulling his jacket tighter around him. But then he heard it again, closer this time, louder. Marcus. His breath caught in his throat. The voice sounded familiar now, almost like someone he knew. But who? He couldn't quite place it, and yet it stirred a strange sense of dread. Clutching his flashlight, he stood up, heart racing, and called out into the fog. "Who's there?" Silence. He strained his ears, listening for any sign of movement, but all he heard was the soft lapping of the lake and the crackling of his dying fire. Then, just as he started to lower the flashlight, he saw something in the fog. A figure stood near the shore, tall and still, barely visible through the thick mist. Marcus squinted, trying to make out details, but the figure's face was hidden in shadow. It was only a silhouette, but he could see that it was looking directly at him. "Hello?" Marcus called out, his voice unsteady. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, watching. His grip tightened on the flashlight as he took a cautious step forward. The fog seemed to thicken, swirling around the figure, obscuring it further. He took another step and then another, but each time he moved, the figure seemed to stay just out of reach, fading into the mist whenever he got closer. He stopped, feeling a chill seep into his bones. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to return to the fire, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to see who or what it was. Swallowing his fear, he called out again. "Who are you? Why are you here?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering his question. Then, in a voice as soft as the breeze, it answered, "Don't you recognize me, Marcus?" Marcus's blood ran cold. The voice was familiar now, unmistakable. It was his own voice, mimicked perfectly, but there was something off about it, something wrong. It sounded hollow, devoid of emotion, like an echo from a nightmare. You're not real," he stammered, backing away. The figure took a step forward, emerging slightly from the fog, and Marcus could see now that it was wearing clothes identical to his own, right down to the same jacket, the same boots. It was like looking into a twisted mirror, but the figure's face was still hidden in shadow. "Oh, I'm real, Marcus," the figure said, its voice echoing his own. "I'm just the part of you that you've forgotten." The figure took another step forward, and Marcus could finally make out its face. His stomach twisted. It was his own face staring back at him, but warped and wrong. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and the eyes were dark and empty, like black pits. Its mouth stretched into a twisted grin that looked far too wide. He stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling to the ground. His flashlight rolled away, casting erratic beams across the trees. He scrambled to his feet, heart hammering, and turned to run back to his campsite. But the fog had grown denser, thicker, and no matter which way he turned, he couldn't find his way. It was as if the trees were closing in around him, swallowing the path he had come from. Panic surged through him as he realized he was completely lost, trapped in an endless maze of mist and shadows. Behind him, the figure's footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves. "You can't run from me, Marcus," it called, its voice now low and mocking. "I am you." He ran faster, pushing through branches that clawed at his skin, desperate to escape. But the footsteps were getting closer, each one louder than the last, until it felt like they were right behind him. He didn't dare look back, too afraid of what he might see. Suddenly, he burst into a small clearing. His campsite was gone, replaced by a strange stone structure he had never seen before. It was a circular formation of ancient stones, arranged in a way that reminded him of a ritual site. In the center was a single, smooth stone that looked like an altar. He stopped, panting, and glanced around, but there was nowhere else to go. The figure was standing at the edge of the clearing now, watching him with that same twisted grin. "You can't escape," it said, voice dripping with malice. "You belong here." Marcus backed away, his eyes darting around, searching for a way out. But as he stepped closer to the altar, he felt something cold wrap around his ankle. He looked down to see roots, black and twisted, snaking up from the ground and wrapping around his legs, holding him in place. "No, no," he shouted, struggling, but the roots only tightened their grip, pulling him closer to the altar. The figure moved forward, closing the distance between them, until it was standing over him, looking down with those empty, hollow eyes. "Don't fight it, Marcus," it whispered, crouching beside him. "This is where you were always meant to be." Marcus felt his strength draining at the world around him growing darker as the figure reached out, pressing a cold hand against his chest. His heart slowed, his vision dimming, as if he were sinking into a dark, endless void. And as he took his last shuddering breath, the last thing he saw was his own face staring down at him, wearing that twisted, mocking grin. Lauren had always been a night owl, but her night shifts as a security guard at the old, abandoned hospital were different. Her friends warned her about the place, but she brushed them off, saying she didn't believe in ghosts. The building was a relic from decades ago, shut down after a fire destroyed one of its wings, taking several lives with it. Ever since, locals claimed the place was haunted, but Lauren thought it was just another spooky story. The first few nights were quiet, just the echo of her footsteps in the empty halls, her flashlight flickering over peeling wallpaper and cracked tiles. Her job was simple: do rounds, check the cameras, lock the gates, and keep anyone from breaking in. But as the week wore on, things started to feel off. One night, just after midnight, she was making her rounds on the second floor when she noticed something strange. The air was thick with a smell she hadn't noticed before, an overwhelming scent of burning wood mixed with something metallic. She scrunched her nose and shone her flashlight down the hall. The beam illuminated a distant figure at the end of the corridor, someone standing perfectly still, facing her with their head slightly tilted. Her stomach clenched. She couldn't make out any features, just a shadowy figure wearing what looked like an old hospital gown. Her mind raced. This had to be someone playing a prank. But the figure didn't move, didn't even flinch as her flashlight hit them. She took a step forward, her heart hammering in her chest, gripping her radio as she called out, "Who's there? You need to leave now." Silence. The figure just stood there like a statue. Slowly, it raised an arm and pointed down the hall, motioning for her to come closer. She hesitated, taking a step back, but the figure didn't waver. Feeling a strange compulsion, she took a few cautious steps forward, her hands shaking, every nerve screaming at her to turn around. But the figure was gone. It hadn't moved. It just wasn't there anymore. She scanned the hallway, her breath shallow, but saw nothing. The smell of burning wood grew stronger, filling her lungs and making her eyes water. She heard something, a faint crackling sound, like the distant snap of a fire. Lauren swallowed hard and checked the rooms as she walked past them, forcing herself to keep moving. Then, just as she neared the end of the hall, she heard it, a soft, distant humming. It sounded like a lullaby sung slowly and faintly, echoing through the empty hospital. She froze, listening. The voice was gentle, almost soothing, but there was something off. It was as if someone were singing just for her, calling her closer. With every step she took, the humming grew louder, more distinct, and then words. Go to sleep, close your eyes and say goodbye." The voice was coming from a room to her right. She raised her flashlight, but the beam flickered, sputtering with each step until it finally gave out, plunging her into darkness. She cursed under her breath, fumbling with the flashlight, slapping it until it finally came back on. When the light returned, she gasped. She was no longer alone. The figure was back, standing just a few feet away from her. This time she could see its face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through her. Its mouth was twisted into a hollow smile, cracked lips barely moving as it whispered, "Come closer, Lauren." She staggered back, heart racing, but her feet felt heavy, rooted to the floor, as if something were holding her there. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, reaching out with bony fingers. She could see now that its hands were covered in burns, skin peeling and raw, and the smell of charred flesh filled the air. Lauren stumbled back, breaking free from whatever had held her in place, and bolted down the hall. She didn't look back, too terrified to see if the figure was following. Her footsteps echoed as she ran, but as she rounded the corner, the lullaby started up again, softer now, but closer, like it was right behind her. She burst into the stairwell, panting, clutching her chest as she descended, her flashlight casting wild shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. She reached the first floor, her mind set on reaching the front doors, but when she turned into the main corridor, she froze. The doors were gone. Where they had been moments ago was now a solid wall, old and crumbling, as if it had been part of the building for years. Panic clawed at her, and she backed up, eyes darting around, searching for another way out. Her only option was the basement, where the old service tunnels ran beneath the building. She hadn't been down there, but she'd heard it connected to an exit on the other side. Taking a deep breath, she made her way down the basement stairs. The humming followed her, faint but relentless, winding down the steps like a haunting refrain. When she reached the basement, the air was frigid. The smell of burned wood was stronger here, almost suffocating. She covered her mouth, fighting the urge to gag as she moved through the narrow corridor. The walls were damp, covered in mildew, and her footsteps echoed eerily in the darkness. As she rounded a corner, her flashlight beam fell on something that made her blood run cold. Carved into the walls were hundreds of names, scratched into the concrete as if by desperate hands. Some of the names were crossed out, while others were marked with strange symbols, smears of something dark and old. And there, at the end of the wall, was her own name, freshly scratched, as if it had just been added. She felt her legs go weak, stumbling back as the humming grew louder, the voice now distorted, warped into a cruel mockery of a lullaby. Go to sleep. Close your eyes. A figure stepped out from the shadows, emerging slowly into the beam of her flashlight. It was the same burned apparition, its charred face grinning, eyes dark and empty. It moved closer, every step deliberate, as if savoring her terror. Lauren backed against the wall, trapped, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way out. But the figure only laughed, a hollow, crackling sound that echoed down the corridor. It raised a hand pointing to the wall, and she saw her name again, newly scratched with the words, "Join us," etched beneath it. The figure leaned in, its face inches from hers, and in a raspy voice, it whispered, "Once you're here, you never leave." With a scream, Lauren bolted, racing down the dark corridor, barely able to see where she was going. She could feel it behind her, hear its footsteps, its laughter, but she didn't dare look back. The tunnels twisted and turned, and she ran blindly, heart pounding, lungs burning, until she finally burst through a door. She stumbled outside, into the cold night air, gasping for breath. She turned back, expecting to see the figure emerging behind her, but there was nothing, only the silent, empty hospital looming in the darkness. The windows were dark, the building still, as if nothing had happened. But when she looked down at her arm, her heart nearly stopped. Scratched into her skin, raw and red, were the words, "You belong to us." The next morning, her supervisor found her car still parked out front, keys still in the ignition. There was no sign of Lauren, just her flashlight, lying on the ground in front of the locked front doors. She was never seen again. Every year, the small town of Ashford celebrated Halloween with a bonfire at the edge of an old forest. Families gathered, children dressed in costumes, and the air was filled with laughter and excitement. But no one stayed after midnight. The forest was said to be haunted by the Watchers, silent figures that appeared only in the darkness, standing just beyond the trees, watching anyone who dared to enter their domain after midnight. On Halloween night, a group of high school seniors, Casey, Ben, Julia, and Mark, decided they'd had enough of the old legends. They dared each other to go into the forest just after midnight, certain they'd find nothing but tall tales. With a flashlight and a few snacks, they entered the woods, laughing and taunting each other. "What do you think the Watchers are, anyway?" Julia asked, rolling her eyes. "Ghosts? Shadows? They're probably just raccoons or something," Mark scoffed. But as they ventured deeper, the laughter died down and an uneasy silence settled over them. The forest was darker than they had anticipated. The canopy of trees blocked the moonlight, casting everything in pitch black. The sound of leaves crunching underfoot and the occasional snap of a branch was all they could hear. As they walked, Casey shone her flashlight across the trees, illuminating only twisted branches and patches of fog. After a few minutes, she lowered her voice, a nervous laugh slipping out. "Okay, this is actually a little creepy. Don't tell me you're scared," Ben teased, nudging her. She rolled her eyes, but her grip on the flashlight tightened. Just then, Mark stopped, his face pale. "Did you see that?" he whispered, pointing ahead. The group froze. There, just beyond the trees, was a shadowy figure. It stood completely still, cloaked in darkness, its face obscured. It was close enough that they could see its outline, a tall figure with long, slender arms hanging at its sides. Casey lifted her flashlight, but as the beam passed over it, the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows. The group exchanged nervous glances. "Probably just a trick of the light," Julia muttered, though her voice trembled. They kept walking, brushing off the siding, but the unease grew. Every so often, they'd catch glimpses of movement, a dark figure slipping between the trees, shadows flickering in the corner of their eyes. Then they heard a sound that made their blood run cold, a soft, echoing whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. Turn back. They all stopped, the silence pressing down on them like a weight. Mark forced a laugh, though his voice shook. All right, who's trying to mess with us? But no one answered. Ben shrugged, trying to sound confident. It's just the wind. They continued on, but the whispers grew louder, filling the air around them, echoing from every direction. Leave while you can. Suddenly, Casey's flashlight began to flicker, casting erratic shadows that seemed to stretch and shift as if the darkness itself were alive. She slapped the flashlight, trying to steady it, but then it went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Panic surged through them. Julia fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight feature, but as soon as she did, she gasped. Standing just a few feet in front of them was another figure, barely visible in the dim light, a pale, hollow-eyed face staring directly at them, expressionless and unmoving. "Run," Casey whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. They turned and sprinted back the way they came, stumbling through the dark forest, branches clawing at their clothes as if trying to pull them back. But no matter how far they ran, the whispers followed them, echoing through the trees. "You're not supposed to be here. It's too late." Ben glanced over his shoulder, and his heart dropped. The watchers were there, behind them, close enough that he could see their empty eyes glinting in the faint light. They weren't running, but somehow they seemed to be keeping pace, gliding silently through the trees. Just as Ben turned forward again, he tripped on a root, crashing to the ground. The others stopped, helping him to his feet, but when they looked around, they realized they were no longer on the path. They were deep in the forest now, surrounded by trees that looked identical in every direction. I think we're lost," Julia whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought we were heading back." "Me too," Casey said, her voice barely audible. "But we've been going in circles." They stood in silence, their breathing heavy, the weight of the forest pressing in on them. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't have come." Mark tried to take control, speaking calmly. "Let's just pick a direction and go. We'll find our way out." But as they turned, they realized they weren't alone. Figures surrounded them, emerging from the shadows. Dozens of them, all with hollow eyes and twisted, expressionless faces. They stood in a circle, blocking every way out, and none of them moved. They just watched. Casey's hands shook as she gripped her flashlight, but it flickered uselessly in her hand. What do you want?" she stammered, though she wasn't sure if these figures could even understand her. One of the watchers stepped forward, moving slowly, its gaze fixed on her. Its mouth opened, but there was no sound, only that same relentless whispering. "Stay with us. Join us." Panic set in, raw and overwhelming, and they backed up, but there was nowhere to go. The watchers closed in, their cold, empty eyes reflecting nothing, their hands reaching out as if to pull them into the shadows. Ben shouted, breaking free from his terror, and ran through a gap between the watchers. The others followed, sprinting blindly through the dark forest. They ran until their lungs burned, until they could no longer hear the whispers, until they burst out of the trees and into the open field. They collapsed, gasping for air, looking back at the dark line of the forest. The watchers were gone. The woods were silent, as if nothing had happened, as if the forest itself had swallowed them up. When they made it back to town, they tried to tell people what they'd seen, but no one believed them. The townspeople only shook their heads, smiling sympathetically, saying they'd probably just scared themselves. But that night, each of them lay in bed, haunted by the memory of those hollow eyes and the whispers that still echoed in their minds. The next morning, Casey woke to find something chilling. Scratched into her windowsill, deep and jagged, were the words, "We are watching you," and she knew they would never stop. Years ago, when Kara was 10, her family bought a rundown Victorian house in the country. It was a beautiful place with intricate woodwork, stained glass, and tall, narrow hallways. But the basement was different. Unlike the rest of the house, which felt bright and open, the basement was cramped, low-ceilinged, and always seemed to have a chill. Kara never liked going down there. There was one particular room at the far end of the basement that was always locked, its chipped wooden door heavy and painted an unusual shade of blue. Kara's parents never mentioned what was in the locked room, brushing off her questions with a casual, "It's just storage." but she knew something wasn't right. Sometimes at night, she'd hear faint, rhythmic tapping sounds coming from below, barely audible but distinct, like a soft knocking echoing up through the vents. The tapping always stopped just before dawn. As the years went by, Kara tried to ignore the sounds, convincing herself it was just the house settling or the pipes. But even in her teens, the basement unsettled her, and she avoided it as much as she could. One night, though, curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to investigate. It was a stormy night, the rain pouring down in sheets, thunder rumbling overhead. Her parents were out for the evening, and the house was dark and quiet. Kara grabbed a flashlight, taking a deep breath as she descended the creaky stairs into the basement. Her steps echoed in the stillness, each one sounding louder than the last. The familiar smell of dust and cold stone filled the air. As she approached the locked door, she noticed something strange. The usual cold draft in the basement was gone, replaced by a thick, musty smell she hadn't noticed before. It reminded her of old, wet earth. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, half hoping it would still be locked. But this time it wasn't. The door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black room beyond. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, but she forced herself to step inside. Her flashlight illuminated the small space, and she saw that it was empty, or almost empty. In the center of the floor was a trapdoor, its edges lined with dust and dirt, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. Her heart pounded as she knelt down, examining it more closely. Something about the trapdoor didn't feel right. It looked newer than the rest of the room, as if someone had installed it long after the house was built. Kara swallowed hard, her fingers tracing the edges of the trapdoor. She knew she shouldn't open it, that whatever lay beneath was probably best left undisturbed. But a strange compulsion came over her, an urge that she couldn't resist. With a deep breath, she pulled the handle. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a narrow, spiraling staircase descending into darkness. A foul odor wafted up, stronger now, almost nauseating. She shone her flashlight down the steps, but could only see a few feet before the light was swallowed by the blackness. Against her better judgment, she stepped onto the stairs, the wood groaning under her weight. As she descended, the air grew colder, and the sound of her breathing echoed in the confined space. She counted each step, trying to calm herself, but after what felt like far too many, she lost count. It was as if the staircase was endless, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Then, suddenly, she reached the bottom. Her flashlight illuminated a small, circular room lined with walls of rough stone. At the center of the room was a wooden chair, and sitting on the chair was a figure, slumped over, its face hidden in the shadows. Kara's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The figure didn't move, but as she got closer, she saw that it wasn't human, at least not anymore. Its clothes were tattered, clinging to its skeletal frame, and its skin was pale and leathery, stretched tightly over its bones. A chill ran down her spine as she realized it was facing her, its hollow eye sockets staring directly at her, as if it had been waiting. Before she could react, a faint sound broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping. She froze, the sound reverberating through the room, growing louder and faster. She whipped around, searching for the source, but there was nothing but darkness. Then she heard a voice, faint and hollow, as if it were coming from far away. It whispered her name, Kara. She backed away, her heart racing, but her legs felt heavy, her body rooted to the spot. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, echoing around her, filling her head with its relentless beat. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound only grew, drilling into her mind. Kara, the voice whispered again, closer this time. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She screamed, whipping around, but there was nothing there. The figure in the chair hadn't moved, but somehow she felt its gaze on her, felt its hollow eyes watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Kara, you shouldn't have come here. The voice was louder now, almost angry, and she stumbled back, desperate to escape. She turned, racing up the stairs, her footsteps echoing with each frantic step. But no matter how fast she climbed, the stairs seemed endless, the darkness pressing in on her, the tapping following her every step. Finally, she burst through the trapdoor, slamming it shut behind her and collapsing on the floor, gasping for breath. The basement was silent again, the air still and cold as if nothing had happened. But as she sat there trying to calm herself, she heard the tapping once more, faint but unmistakable, coming from beneath the floor. That night, she told her parents what she'd found, begging them to lock the door, to keep whatever was down there from coming up. But they only looked at each other, their faces pale, and said, "Kara, there is no trapdoor in that room." She returned to the basement the next day, like her parents by her side, and when they opened the door, the room was empty. The trapdoor was gone, replaced by smooth, unbroken floorboards. Her parents tried to reassure her, said she must have dreamed it, that the storm had unsettled her. But every night since, as she lay in bed, she heard the tapping, faint and persistent, echoing up through the floorboards. And sometimes, just before dawn, she'd hear the voice again, whispering her name from somewhere deep below. "Kara, come back." When Liz moved into her new apartment, it seemed too good to be true. Charming, affordable, and just a short walk to her work. Her only hesitation was the strange old woman who lived across the hall, who would watch her intently whenever she passed. Her skin was thin and papery, with deep-set eyes that followed Liz without a word. One evening, as Liz unlocked her door, the old woman's door creaked open. The woman's voice, scratchy and hoarse, broke the silence. "Don't leave your windows open at night. They come in when you're asleep." Liz forced a polite smile and nodded, though the warning made her uneasy. She didn't know who they were, and she didn't really want to know. The next few days passed quietly, but Liz kept the windows shut, if only to appease the strange woman. One night, Liz was woken by a faint scratching sound. Disoriented, she glanced around the dark room. Her clock read 3:27 a.m., and the noise seemed to be coming from the living room. She sat up, holding her breath, and listened. The scratching grew louder, like something clawing against wood. Liz's heart raced. She'd locked all the windows and doors before bed, so it couldn't be an animal. Trying to ignore the icy prickling sensation down her spine, she told herself it was probably just a tree branch scraping against the window. She buried herself under her blankets, waiting for the noise to stop. The next morning, she found nothing unusual. The windows were locked, and there was no sign of anything out of place. She brushed it off as her imagination, exhausted and jumpy from a poor night's sleep. But the following night, the scratching returned. It was louder this time, urgent and frantic, accompanied by faint tapping sounds, almost like fingers. Liz crept out of bed, clutching her phone tightly, and walked toward the living room. As she stepped into the hall, the noise stopped abruptly. The silence was so sudden and complete that it made her skin crawl. She checked the windows. They were still locked. Her phone's flashlight swept over the room, illuminating nothing but her couch and coffee table. She felt silly, foolish even, as she shuffled back to her bed. It was probably just a neighbor, she thought, laughing at her own nerves. The next morning, she found scratches on the window pane. They were thin and shallow, but unmistakable, crisscrossing the glass in a chaotic pattern. A chill crept up her spine, and she couldn't shake the old woman's warning. "Don't leave your windows open at night." By now, Liz was too unsettled to ignore it. She decided to confront her neighbor, hoping the woman might offer some explanation. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. After a moment of hesitation, Liz leaned her ear to the door and called out softly. Still, there was only silence. It was strange, she thought, since the woman rarely left her apartment. A neighbor passing by noticed her and stopped, giving her a curious look. When Liz explained, the neighbor frowned and shook her head. "There's no old woman living there. That apartment's been empty for months." Liz laughed nervously, convinced there was a mistake. "I see her every day," she insisted. "She even warned me about my windows." The neighbor just shook her head again, her expression clouded. "Maybe someone's been squatting, but I can promise you no one lives there officially. That woman you're talking about, the last tenant was an old lady. She died over a year ago." Liz's blood ran cold. She returned to her apartment, her thoughts racing, feeling foolish and terrified all at once. But she resolved to stay calm, to ignore the stories. Her apartment was safe, empty. She didn't believe in ghosts, she told herself. There had to be a reasonable explanation. That night, she lay awake, listening to every creak, every whisper of the building settling. The clock ticked past midnight, then 1, then 2, her exhaustion overpowering her fear. Just as she began to drift off, the scratching started again. This time, it was right outside her bedroom window. Liz lay frozen in her bed, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. The scratching was slow and methodical, as if whatever was outside was carefully, deliberately clawing its way in. And then she heard it, the faintest whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Let me in." Her entire body went cold. She tried to tell herself she was imagining it, that she was half asleep, that she was only dreaming, but the whisper grew louder, closer, pleading. "Please, let me in." She clamped her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face, willing it to stop, willing it to go away. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the scratching stopped. The silence was worse somehow, heavier, pressing down on her. She lay in bed, not daring to move, waiting for the morning light. When dawn finally broke, she forced herself to go to the window, heart racing. The glass was covered in scratches, deep gouges that hadn't been there the night before, claw marks carved in jagged lines across the pane. She stumbled back, horrified, her mind reeling. And there, in the frost that had settled on the glass, were finger-shaped streaks, as if someone had pressed their hands to the window, their fingertips leaving trails as they tried to get in. In the days that followed, Liz felt watched, an intense feeling of being observed whenever she was in her apartment. Doors creaked open on their own, shadows shifted in her periphery, and the faint smell of decay lingered, no matter how much she cleaned. She barely slept, her exhaustion bordering on hysteria. Desperate, she finally contacted the building manager, begging him to let her move units, even offering to pay extra. When he reluctantly agreed, she moved out immediately, taking only what she could carry. On her last day, as she was gathering her things, she glanced one last time at the apartment across the hall. The door was open, just a crack, and inside she caught a glimpse of the old woman. She was standing in the shadows, watching her mouth stretched into a wide, hollow grin. And as Liz hurried down the stairs, she heard it one last time, faint but clear, echoing from somewhere above her. "You should have let me in." In the small town of Hollow Oaks, there was an old, forgotten train station nestled just outside the woods. The locals rarely spoke of it, calling it the Midnight Station. Legend had it that if you waited alone on the platform at exactly 12:01 a.m., you'd hear the sound of a train approaching, even though no train had run on those tracks for over 50 years. And if you were brave or foolish enough to step aboard, you'd never be seen again. One rainy autumn night, Emma, a local college student, dared her friends to go to the station with her. They'd been telling ghost stories, egging each other on, and now her friends dared her to prove she wasn't scared. With the thrill of adventure, Emma accepted, brushing off the stories as nothing more than superstitions. Her friends stayed behind, laughing nervously as they watched her walk down the overgrown path to the abandoned platform. Rain pattered softly on the platform as Emma's footsteps echoed in the night. She checked her phone. It was 11:58 p.m. The silence was oppressive, thick with a sense of anticipation that made her uneasy. But she pushed it aside, reminding herself it was just a silly legend. At 12:01 a.m. exactly, the air grew cold, and a faint rumbling sound began to fill the air. She looked down the tracks, and to her shock, she saw headlights piercing through the darkness. She laughed nervously, telling herself it was probably an old train being moved or maybe a trick of the storm. But the train kept coming, its massive, dark shape pulling into the station in absolute silence, steam hissing softly as it came to a stop before her. The doors slid open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The seats were dusty, with old luggage resting in the overhead compartments, as if left behind in a hurry. She hesitated, the urge to step back overwhelming, but the thought of her friend's teasing pushed her forward. She climbed aboard, her footsteps echoing through the empty car as she took a seat near the back, looking around nervously. The doors slid shut, and the train began to move, gliding down the tracks with an eerie silence. Outside, the scenery was distorted, dark, and almost unreal. The trees seemed twisted, their branches stretching like skeletal arms toward the train, and a thick mist shrouded the windows, obscuring her view. She tried to text her friends, but her phone had no signal. The minutes dragged by, each one stretching longer than the last. Emma shifted in her seat, a growing unease settling over her. She looked around and noticed something chilling. She wasn't alone. Sitting a few rows ahead, partially hidden in the shadows, was a figure. It was still, hunched over, its face obscured by the hood of a long, ragged coat. She stared, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. "Excuse me?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. She couldn't even see it breathing. Her pulse quickened as she looked around, realizing more figures were scattered throughout the car, all hunched and cloaked in shadows. They sat silently, unmoving, their heads turned slightly toward her as if they were aware of her presence. Her stomach twisted, and she stood, gripping the back of her seat. "Hello? Is anyone there?" A chill ran through her as one of the figures slowly turned its head. She could barely make out its face in the dim light, but what she saw made her blood run cold. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over sharp, sunken features. Its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light, and its mouth was twisted into a grimace. Emma stumbled back, her heart pounding. She rushed to the door at the end of the car, pulling frantically, but it wouldn't budge. The other figures began to move now, their heads turning in unison to face her, their hollow eyes fixated on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She bolted down the aisle, desperate to escape, but the doors between the cars were locked, trapping her inside. She glanced back, and her stomach dropped as she saw that the figures were standing now, moving toward her with slow, gas-jerking steps. Their arms reached out, bony fingers curling as if to grasp her. "Let me out!" she screamed, pounding on the doors. Her voice echoed through the empty car, swallowed by the silence. Then one of the figures spoke, its voice a low, rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here." The lights flickered, and the car plunged into darkness. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps as she felt a cold, bony hand close around her wrist. She screamed, pulling away, stumbling backward until she fell against a seat. She could feel their presence all around her, the cold air thick with the stench of decay, filling her nostrils, making her gag. Just as she felt herself being dragged down into the darkness, the lights flickered back on. She was alone in the car, her heart pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. The figures were gone, but their presence lingered, an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. The train slowed to a stop, and the doors slid open, revealing a desolate platform that looked nothing like the one she'd started at. The ground was cracked, weeds pushing through the cement, and a thick fog hung low over the scene, giving it a ghostly, abandoned look. Emma stepped off the train, her legs shaky, barely able to support her weight. As she turned to look back, she saw her reflection in the train's windows, and behind her, dozens of shadowy faces stared out, their hollow eyes fixed on her with haunting intensity. She turned and ran, stumbling through the mist, desperate to get away. She didn't look back until she was sure she was alone. When she finally reached her friends, they looked at her in shock, their faces pale. "What happened to you?" they asked, their voices filled with concern. She could only shake her head, unable to find the words to explain what she'd seen. But when she looked down, she noticed something that sent a shiver down her spine. Her wrist, where the figure had grabbed her, was bruised, the imprint of bony fingers etched deep into her skin. The next day, she returned to the midnight station with a group of locals, hoping to show them the abandoned platform where she had boarded the train. But when they arrived, all that was left were rusted tracks and weeds. The platform had been demolished long ago, and the locals insisted no train had ever passed through those tracks in decades. Still, she couldn't shake the memory of the faces staring out at her from the train's windows, nor the lingering chill that seemed to follow her, like an unseen presence watching her from the shadows. To this day, if she listens closely on rainy autumn nights, she can hear the faint sound of a train whistle in the distance, growing louder with each passing minute, as if it's coming for her, as if it's waiting for her to return. Years ago, the old house at the end of Hawthorne Street was known as the Whitmore House. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, surrounded by rumors and whispers. People claimed it was haunted, cursed, or worse, that something evil lived there, hidden in the dark corners, waiting. But like any legend, it was impossible to resist. And over the years, curious kids would sneak in on dares, hoping for a thrill. They rarely made it past the front hallway before running out in a panic. But then, one Halloween night, Mark and his friends decided to break the mold. They were 17 and bored, looking for an adventure, something that would make them feel brave. So they dared each other to spend the night inside the Whitmore house. They brought flashlights, a few snacks, and one of those old camcorders Mark's dad kept in the garage. They wanted proof. As they approached the house, a cold wind whipped through the trees, making the branches scratch against each other like fingers tapping on glass. The house loomed over them, dark and silent, its windows shattered and walls sagging with age. The front door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar, as if inviting them inside. The minute they stepped across the threshold, they felt the temperature drop. The house smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet. They dismissed it, laughing nervously, pushing each other forward as they explored the first floor. Dust hung thick in the air and the wooden floors creaked under their weight. Mark turned on the camcorder, laughing at the grainy footage. "Come on, guys, smile for the ghost cam," he joked, his voice echoing off the cracked walls. They explored each room, finding nothing but broken furniture, scattered debris, and walls lined with peeling wallpaper. The house was empty, silent. They started to relax, sitting on the floor of what must have once been the living room, telling scary stories by the dim glow of their flashlights. Around midnight, they heard it, the faint sound of a child's laughter coming from upstairs. It was high-pitched and eerie, echoing down the empty hallways. Mark turned the camcorder toward the staircase, heart pounding as he whispered to his friends, "Did you guys hear that?" One of his friends, Jenny, nodded, her face pale. "Maybe it's the wind," she suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. But then the laughter came again, louder this time, and it sounded unmistakably like a child playing, a girl giggling softly as if she were watching them. The laughter faded, and then they heard footsteps, light and quick, scurrying across the floor above them. Mark, feeling a mix of excitement and fear, held up the camcorder and whispered, "Let's check it out. If it's just the wind, we'll see." Reluctantly, the group made their way upstairs, their flashlights shaking as they climbed the rickety staircase. The house felt different up there, darker, colder. The laughter continued, leading them down the hall and toward a door at the end. The door was slightly open, and as they approached, they saw a faint glow seeping from within, flickering like candlelight. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to proceed, but Mark stepped forward, pushing the door open. The room was empty, but in the middle of the floor was an old doll, dressed in a tattered lace-trimmed dress. Its glassy eyes stared up at them, unblinking, and one of its arms was outstretched as if reaching for something. Around it were small, dusty handprints smeared across the floor. They backed away, ready to leave, but the door suddenly slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. The laughter echoed around them again, louder as if coming from every corner of the room. The doll's head turned slightly, and its eyes seemed to follow them, the faintest hint of a grin stretching across its cracked porcelain face. Jenny screamed, grabbing Mark's arm. "Let's get out of here!" Mark tried to open the door, but it was stuck, as if something heavy was pressing against it from the other side. Panic set in as they pounded on the door, shouting for help, even though they knew no one would hear them. The laughter grew louder, shifting into something darker, a low, guttural chuckle, inhuman and menacing. Then, without warning, the laughter stopped, replaced by a voice, soft and chilling, that whispered from the darkness, "You shouldn't have come here." The lights on their flashlights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Mark fumbled with the camcorder, hoping its light might still work. He pointed at the doll, but what he saw through the viewfinder made his blood run cold. Standing behind the doll was the faint outline of a figure, a young girl, her face hidden in shadow. She stood still, watching them, her eyes empty and hollow, her hands clasped together as if waiting. Slowly she raised one hand and pointed at them, her mouth opening in a silent scream that filled their minds with an unearthly wail. The room seemed to close in on them, the walls pressing closer as the girl's figure grew clearer, her eyes widening, filled with malice. Mark dropped the camcorder, and it clattered to the floor, the night vision lens capturing the last moments as the doll's head twisted to face them, the girl's shadow looming over it, merging with it. With one final burst of strength, they managed to break the door open, stumbling out into the hallway. They didn't look back, didn't dare stop until they were outside, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The house was silent once more, done lifeless, as if nothing had happened. When they returned home, shaken and silent, they replayed the footage on Mark's camcorder, hoping it might explain what they'd seen. The video was clear at first, showing them exploring the house, laughing nervously until they reached the room with the doll. But then the footage grew distorted, static filling the screen, interspersed with brief, chilling images. The doll's face close up, its cracked lips twisted into a grin, the shadowy figure of the girl watching them from behind, and finally a pair of hollow, lifeless eyes staring directly into the camera. Then the video cut to black, but the audio continued, a faint whisper echoing through the speakers. "You'll come back. They always do." The screen went dark, but as they sat there, frozen in horror, a soft, familiar giggle echoed from the camcorder's speakers. A child's laughter, faint and eerie, growing louder as if coming closer. To this day, no one has dared to step foot in the Whitmore house again. But some say that if you listen closely on Halloween night, you can still hear that laughter echoing down Hawthorne Street, as if the house itself is waiting for its next visitor. And as for Mark and his friends, they never spoke of that night again. But they all knew that the memory of those hollow eyes would haunt them forever.